And so even the postmoderns themselves, when they are saying what they are doing, they are saying things like, we go all the way back to the Greeks, right? And say the Greeks made a fatal mistake in how they did philosophy, and 2,000 years later, that has reached its failure, right? So the postmoderns are making a certain kind of grand historical claim. Or postmodernism is a skepticism toward meta-narratives. So we might say Marxism is a meta-narrative. It tries to explain the whole world. Nietzsche, whom you mentioned, has a meta-narrative. He's trying to come up with a philosophical explanation of how the whole world works. So the postmoderns are saying, yes, there are all of these narratives, and we accept that they more or less try to hang together and give these big picture explanations. And there are even these meta-narratives. So when we say Marxism, when we say Nietzscheanism, we know what we are talking about. And our claim as postmoderns is those meta-narratives are also false, wrong. We are skeptical about all of them.
Skepticism of meta-narratives. Maybe you could also call it a philosophy of negation. I think we see the word interrogate pop out a lot in postmodernism. We interrogate criminals, critique, interrogation. So I think you could also call it a systemic mistrust and organized skepticism, so to speak. And who is not to be trusted? Well, everyone, including the scientists and so on. You can use negation in skepticism as a tool for exploration, or what postmodernists do is they don't use negation as a tool. Negation is a goal, not a tool. That's their objective, is to negate, not to explore.
Correct, right. So the moderns will then say, yeah, we are being skeptical against what we take to be failed epistemologies, but we're also going to build, I would say, small s skepticism into our positive project. If, for example, I say skepticism is true, right? That is paradoxical, right? Because then I am making a truth claim, but skepticism is supposed to be to say there is no such thing as truth. If I say, for example, I am skeptical or suspicious of all meta-narratives, right? Well, that is a meta-narrative itself.
So what I'm going to say is,
you know what, Stephen, let's dig right into this. Let's dig right into it. We're going to talk about postmodernism. We're going to talk about mainly the negatives, but we will try to talk about some positives.
Go for it.
I want to maybe start with the boring question, which is the definition, which is it's hard to get by because there seems to be some different definitions depending on who you ask and what their perspective is on postmodernism. So before we start, maybe how do you define it?
Well, at a high level, if you're going to take the post as postmodern, you first ask, what is the modern? And there you get historians saying we go back to around 1500, 500 years or so, transition from the pre-modern world into the modern world. Or if you ask philosophers, they will say, what's the beginnings of modern philosophy? They will take us back to Francis Bacon in England, René Descartes, John Locke a little bit later. So 1500s to 1600s as a huge transition from the pre-modern to the modern. And then the postmoderns are going to say that entire philosophical framework that was launched in the 1500s and 1600s, and now 300 years later, we think that it has failed, that it has reached its end, that it was wrong from the beginning, and we are going to go post or go beyond it. So what they will then do is to say that it is a philosophical, intellectual transformation that then had huge historical impact. And that is what they are rejecting fundamentally. Now, with that framing, then we ask, well, what is this philosophical framing that they are rejecting? I would say it's going to be a philosophical framing because the most important postmoderns are all philosophers by training, by profession. So if you think of, Jacques Derrida, PhD in philosophy, Michel Foucault, PhD in philosophy and also in psychology, Jean-Francois Lyotard, PhD in philosophy, Richard Rorty, PhD in philosophy. They are all explicitly philosophers taking a philosophical perspective on what has gone on in the world intellectually for the last 300 or 400 years. Now, the most important thing that they will all emphasize, I will just, because time is short, reduce it to two fundamental things. First, what is the status of reasoning, the scientific project, rationality, our capacity for using our senses, say, using logic, using the power of abstraction, mathematics, and so forth. Now, the modern world is revolutionary in that when you look at all of the founding moderns, Bacon, Descartes, Locke, all in the 1600s, they will reject traditional epistemologies that say we should rely on mystical insights that prophets some centuries ago or millennia ago received. We should have faith in Scripture, or we should have faith in the authority of various institutions. And so all of the pre-modern dominant, at least for the last 1,000 years, before 1500 and 1600, had said it's some combination of mystical revelation and faith in Scripture and tradition. That's how we come to know the important truths in the world. The moderns are revolutionary because they are rejecting all of that. We can use our senses, as Bacon argues, to observe the world, to start forming abstractions and more general principles. We can do science, and we can objectively figure out the way the world works. Now, Descartes' version is a little different. He says we can start with reason by and large by itself, figure out some self-evident truths, and rationally deduce various objective truths about ourselves and about the world. So for them, the fundamental is reason. Reason is objective, it works, and we should rely on it. Also, this is the closely related point then, aside from the status of reason, the importance of the individual. Again, in the pre-modern world, you're born into a feudal class, you're born into the peasant class, or you're born into a guild, or you're born into an aristocratic class, you're born a boy, you're born a girl. And the most important thing is your group membership, not your individuality. Along come the moderns, and they are revolutionary in this respect also, to say, no, every individual has the capacity for reasoning, for observing the world, for thinking for himself, and then increasingly for herself. We should, each of us, think for ourselves. And what I come to believe and how I shape my character and act in the world, I should be judged as an individual, first and foremost, not as a member of a group or a member of a caste. Now, if you take just those 2 points, as the story I think is more complicated, but those are important and revolutionary foundational points in the modern worldview. We are individuals with the capacity for reason, and so on the basis of that, cognitively, I should think for myself. Morally, I am self-responsible, and that's going to have lots of social implications. We'll see the rise of women's rights. We'll see the abolishment of slavery. We see democratic and republican politics. We see people as able to choose whatever work they want to do, to trade with anybody they want, free market, basically economics as well. All of that is downstream from those two fundamentals. Now, if that as a thumbnail characterization of what the modern is, then when we jump to the latter part of the 20th century, the postmodern thinkers, all of them are explicitly saying both of those 2 points are false and wrong. Reason is a failure. And so what they are doing is they are standing at the tail end of a long set of traditions of skeptical arguments. that have been developed by philosophers about various aspects of reason. And by the time they get to the 1950s, 1960s, that's when the guys we mentioned, Foucault, Derrida, Rorty, and the others, they're getting their PhDs in philosophy from very good schools. They're really up to speed, and all of them buy into and accept the strongest skeptical arguments that have been developed against the senses, against concept formation, against logic, against mathematics, against the scientific method. All of that worked out account of reason they think is a failure. We are not fundamentally rational beings. Reason is not about acquiring objective knowledge of reality. And instead, they then switch to saying, well, reason is some sort of subjective language game with arbitrary definitions. That's a more Derrida line that we are going to go. And you can manipulate language however you want to make it mean whatever you want, and there are oppositions, and language has no connection at all to reality. Or you might say, what we call reason is really after the fact rationalization of my value goals. I want power. I want to control and dominate other people. And that's my value orientation toward the world. And what we call reason is just making up stories to rationalize my power plays against other people in the world. And that's more of a Foucault type of story about it. So the point then is we reject reason as an efficacious, as an objective faculty, and we substitute various sorts of non-rational or anti-rational understanding of what's going on in the human mind. And then on the individualist side, all of them will reject the idea that individuals have autonomy. Certainly, they don't have a rational, objective capacity for figuring out the way the world works themselves. They buy into various versions of what we call social construction. The individual is more plastic, just born into various social groups, molded and manipulated by those social groups. And all of those social groups, of course, are in conflict with each other. They hate each other. The rich hate the poor. Men and women are in conflict with each other. The races are in conflict with each other. The ethnicities are in conflict with each other. So individuals end up just being, constellation of these group forces that have molded and manipulated them. And so what we then need to do is see people not as individuals, but just as parts of groups that are in conflict with each other and trying to do linguistic manipulations of each other or various other kinds of power plays with each other. And there's no truth, there's no individuality, there is no ultimate justice. It's just an ugly social free-for-all. And that is what I would say is the essence of the postmodern. It's a rejection of those modern fundamentals and a replacement with kind of a negative, skeptical, cynical philosophy in its place. All right, how's that as a start?
Ah, that's great. You know what? I like the fact that you actually did a lot more research than a majority of critics of postmodernism. That's the first thing. You seem to be a typical nerd. You seem to be someone whose ideal day is to go to the library with a book. Although you don't really seem to be someone who actually reads what the teacher assigns, though.
Well, both of those are true.
Well, there you go. The number one is that you also touched on how important philosophy actually is. I think that most political discussions, if not all of them, are actually philosophical discussions. And I want to play a devil's advocate a little bit on that definition. And you told me, well, someone could say that in the definition there could be a pitfall. Like, for example, defining postmodernism by first constructing a unified modernism, um, can turn intellectual history into a morality play instead of a messy evolution of ideas. Do you know what I mean? Could it presume that modernity basically spoke with one voice? So postmodernism is a cast as its negation. So then, when in reality both are actually internally fractured and cross pollinated, so to speak. And then by framing postmodernism as merely reactive, the method kind of strips the independent roots in linguistics, and also earlier critics of truth, like Nietzsche, for instance. So the result is kind of like a narrative that feels explanatory, but actually pre-decides the verdict. So reason builds, and then postmodernism destroys. Could it be that maybe a richer account would begin not with opposition, but with genealogy of idea that makes simple origin stories collapse? Do you know what I mean? I don't know. It's maybe it's a weird question, but yeah.
Hmm. Oh, yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, well, no, that's a very good question about how one does history in the first place. So certainly when one does history, you look at actual historical events, actual historical individuals, and then you do start to group them into cause and effect. This led to this, which led to this, which led to that. So there are cause and effect claims across time. And that then means you have to have a good account of cause and effect, which is to take one into a philosophical issue right there. If one is skeptical about cause and effect, if you think the world is more constructed by randomness, and this happened later, but it has no connection really to what happened earlier, then you're going to be skeptical even just about doing basic historical causal timelines. Another way we do it, though, is to say, well, we look at particular events and we look at particular individuals, and then we start to say, well, these individuals seem to be saying more or less the same thing, acting in the same general pattern, so we're going to put them in a group. Right? We're going to say there's this collection of individuals and they form a movement or they form a school, and we'll put a label on that collection of individuals. Now that then is to move not along a timeline, but to move up and down in levels of generality and levels of abstraction. And again, we then have to have a good theory of generalizations and a good theory of abstractions. And if we are skeptical rather about our capacity to form generalizations and abstractions, then of course we're going to say that that approach to history also is fraud. So what we can then just do is we can then say if we are skeptical, then we're going to give up on the whole historical project anyways. So part of the presumption of being able to talk about broad labels like postmodern and modern is a pretty ambitious understanding that we can take entire chunks of historical time and assign labels on them. Say that was the Renaissance, that was the Enlightenment, that is Romanticism, okay? And there are going to be people who are skeptical and push back against all of that. And also, we are going to be quite ambitious by saying, well, if this happens in the 1600s, then that sets the stage for what happens in the 1700s, and that sets the stage for what happens in the 1800s. And so, again, we're going to be quite ambitious about being able to sketch cause and effect intellectual lineages across generations, across even centuries. But again, if we're going to be very skeptical, we can just again say that entire historical project is useless. So all of those arguments have to be engaged by the historians, by the philosophers of historians. Now, the debate, though, between the moderns and the postmoderns presupposes, at least on the faces of it, that we can do all of that. And so even the postmoderns themselves, when they are saying what they are doing, they are saying things like, we go all the way back to the Greeks, right? And say the Greeks made a fatal mistake in how they did philosophy, and 2,000 years later, that has reached its failure, right? So the postmoderns are making a certain kind of grand historical claim. Or if you take someone like Lyotard, he will say, postmodernism, his formulation of it is a skepticism toward meta-narratives. You may have heard that formulation. And to take your language here, a narrative is a story that we tell about reality. So Lyotard is already accepting that we tell lots of stories about the way the world works. We have all of these theories and hypotheses, right, and so on. And then what he means by a meta-narrative is to say we step back from these big picture narratives and we try to have some really grand narrative about the whole shebang. So we might say Marxism is a meta-narrative. It tries to explain the whole world. Nietzsche, whom you mentioned, has a meta-narrative. He's trying to come up with a philosophical explanation of how the whole world works. So the postmoderns are saying, yes, there are all of these narratives, and we accept that they more or less try to hang together and give these big picture explanations. And there are even these meta-narratives. So when we say Marxism, when we say Nietzscheanism, we know what we are talking about. And our claim as postmoderns is those meta-narratives are also false, wrong. We are skeptical about all of them. Or, just to take another example, Foucault will explicitly say, we are entering the postmodern era, and what I mean by that is to look back at the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, again, is going to be one of these very broad labels, 1700s, broadly speaking, pro-science, pro-industrial revolution, pro-democratic republicanism, right, anti-feudalism. So there is this big narrative, big picture story that we call the Enlightenment with a whole bunch of elements. And Foucault will say, we know what that means. The historians have worked all of that out. But I, Foucault, am saying that entire narrative is wrong, right? and faulty. So if we are going to play the game of modern versus postmodern, we are already 2 or 3 steps into saying, yes, we think we can do history. Yes, we think we can do philosophy. We can do these big abstractions that when I say the Enlightenment is a failure, as Foucault says, as Richard Dworkin says, we know what that means. If we say that those were modern revolutionary eras against the entire pre-modern era, that we are cognitively successful, we know what we are talking about, and we postmoderns are making a big picture historical and philosophical claim, just that ours is negative. So
skepticism of meta narratives. Never heard of that before. Actually, I wrote it down. I think that's a genius definition. Maybe you could also call it a philosophy of negation. And I think what that allows them to do is to inquire just about everything and to interrogate. I think we see the word interrogate pop out a lot in postmodernism. But we interrogate criminals. So critique, interrogation. So I think you could also call it a systemic mistrust and organized skepticism, so to speak. And who is not to be trusted? Well, everyone, including the scientists and so on. And it also seemed to so on the shallow, I think interrogate, criticize, it seems to be something that's open-minded and kind of free. But what I've noticed is that with postmodernists, they say beware of angry teachers, right? I think another thing to be really concerned about is that postmodernists have a very, I think on a holistic level, it's very subtle, but they have very few emotions, and they're all negative. And I don't believe that teachers only implement their knowledge and beliefs onto the students, but also their rage. Because postmodernism seems to be very not free when it comes to emotions. So they're not very happy about the world. They all seem to be negative. And I'm really concerned about them implementing this into the next generation, because the world is not just black. And I am a little bit concerned about this excessive negativity. How big of a problem do you think this could be, or has it shown up to be? Or is it in fact not a problem?
Is something interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals? Starting therapy can be hard. The right therapist for you may not be in your area. BetterHelp is now sponsoring this podcast. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. With BetterHelp, you can have your therapy session as a phone call, as a video chat, or even via messaging if you prefer that. If you think you might benefit from therapy, consider BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/Captainese. Clicking that link helps you support this channel, and it also gives you a 10% off your first month of BetterHelp so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. Again, go to betterhelp.com/Captainese. Clicking that link gives you 10% off your first month of therapy.
That's kind of two big issues that you put together, and they are connected. The first one being the skepticism, and I like your phrase, the systemic skepticism. But I think we need to drill down a little bit into that phrase, because skepticism was also built into the modern project. So when they say that the skeptics say, well, we have this traditional epistemology that says we should have faith in institutions, we should have faith in scripture, maybe some special of us should seek revelations. And the moderns will say we are skeptical about all of that. So part of the modern project is a negative project against what they take to be an earlier failed epistemology or set of cognitive attitudes. And then when they turn to the positive, they say, yes, we should be.
It could be that it could be I'm so sorry for interrupting you, but it could be that you can use negation in skepticism as a tool for exploration, or what postmodernists do is they don't use negation as a tool. Negation is a goal, not a tool. That's their objective, is to negate, not to explore, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the distinction. Correct. Right. So the moderns will then say, yeah, we are being skeptical against what we take to be failed epistemologies, but we're also going to build, I would say, small s skepticism into our positive project. So even when we are rational, right, and I say, here is some evidence, I'm going to say, well, could this evidence be looked at a different way? And I come up with a hypothesis. And part of it is looking for supporting evidence for the hypothesis, but it's also asking, if I step outside of that hypothesis and try to criticize and critique it, can I find some weaknesses? And part of the modern method is to say, primarily doing science or just general thinking is an individual responsibility, but it's really complicated. And there's a value to doing a lot of these things socially. We can divide the intellectual labor. But also, we know that on complicated issues, chances are good you've taken a certain amount of information and put it together this way to come up with this hypothesis. I've taken maybe this pretty much the same bundle of information, but I put it together in a slightly different way to come up with this different hypothesis. And both of us are reasonable individuals, but how we can improve is by getting together socially. Maybe I will write up my hypothesis and then could submit it to a journal or for publication, and you will critique it. And I know that you will skeptically criticize my view. And out of that process, we will see what is strong and what is weak in my view. And I will do the same thing with respect to you. So that process of peer review and entering into debate and discussion and putting our ideals to the test is to incorporate skepticism into the process, that we're not going to believe things easily. And it's only after we've got a huge amount of positive evidence, positive logic, and we've done the best skeptical things we can with respect to those hypotheses, then we will believe in all of those things. But the moderns are optimistic in the sense of saying, if we go through that process, we can, in fact, learn facts. We can understand what is true. We can acquire knowledge. We can be objective. And some elements of skepticism are incorporated into our methods of objectivity. So the postmoderns, though, are more radical than that, because what they want to do is partly deny that there is such a thing as a positive account that we can figure out of the world, and all we are left with is skepticism. So they are not skepticism as a tool along the way to help us get to the truth, but only skepticism because nothing can withstand skeptical critique. And so we end up in a negative place entirely. So it's a systemic skepticism, as you put it. Now, the second part of your question then is to talk about the emotional universe of postmodernism, so to speak. Now, we human beings, we have a whole range of emotions, hundreds and hundreds of them, some positive, some negative, some mixed, depending on the circumstance. And I think you are right to say that characteristically, postmodernism tends to the negative. They tend to be skeptical and cynical about anything positive, and to put at the fore negative emotions, anger, rage, suspicion, and so forth, and all kinds of socially adversarial emotions. And this, I think, raises a very interesting question within I think of it as the psychology of philosophy. So it is possible, I think, that one can be a normal human being with a normal range of emotions. But then you start taking philosophy very seriously. And for whatever reason, because of the professors you are exposed or just the accident of your reading materials, you read only negative thinkers. And because these guys are very smart and clever and worked out very arguments, you come to be convinced by all sorts of negative, skeptical, cynical, jaded philosophical understandings of the world. You come to believe that everything is crap. And what will then happen as a result of your doing philosophy is your psychology will change, because you will now be seeing the world through an entirely negative set of philosophical beliefs. And what will become characteristic and automatic for you is to react to everything negatively. And I think that's one possible route in terms of the relationship between philosophy and psychology. I do think, though, this perhaps is where some of your suspicion is coming from, that in many cases, what happens is that the psychology comes first, and that many people who are young, for whatever reason, they are already damaged, broken, negative, cynical people. And they are smart enough to say, I'm going to read some philosophy or whatever, but they are then naturally attracted to the negative philosophers. And so they will read only philosophers that they think are already on the right track because of their negative psychological disposition. And then what you end up with is a kind of confirmation bias. Right? So you only read philosophers whom you think are on the right page with respect to your negativity, but because they are very sharp and brilliant, they give you more ammunition and more confirmation for your negativity, so they make it even more and more negative. And so you end up with a kind of vicious cycle of negativity. And then socially, of course, once you are pretty far down that road, you will start only associating with other people who are like-minded. You won't be reading other people. You won't be engaging with other people. You'll find ways to get rid of them. And so you end up with a self-reinforcing negative social world as well.
Yeah, I don't think you can make a case that postmodernism is a critique of reason rather than a whole rejection. I don't think you can say that postmodernism introduced elements of slave morality to enlightenment. I don't think you can make that case. And in that case, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if here, I think maybe I am less concerned now with postmodernism because it seems to be eating its own tail. Because if we make toleration, for example, a universal value, and you cannot make that compatible with relativism, because relativism always has to retreat to individual. So that would mean that toleration is not only his value, and that means it shouldn't be his value. So I mean, am I off with saying that there seems to be a shift in postmodernism where at least a string of postmodernists are in a process of exiting it in principle? Because if you believe in utopia, and which is a stepping stone out of postmodernism, because that means that there is a reality that is better than this reality, and that you know how to get there, that means that that's objectivism and that's universalism. That's not relativism. Do you know what I mean? Is that it's not eating its own tail that way. Because they are striving for something that they believe it's better, but there's no such thing as better. So you are exiting postmodernism.
Yeah. Yeah, there are paradoxes, of course, built into any skeptical, relativistic, subjectivist philosophy. And I think that is part of what is built into your question, or your and the set of observations surrounding it. So, if, for example, I say skepticism is true, right? That that is paradoxical, right? Because then I am making a truth claim, but skepticism is supposed to be to say there is no such thing as truth. If I say, for example, I am skeptical or suspicious of all meta narratives, right? Well, that is a meta narrative itself, right? So what I'm doing is I'm saying there's these narratives, and then there's all these meta narratives, and I'm taking all of those. That's a very big, universal, general claim, and I am rejecting all of them. Well, that is a meta narrative. It's a negative meta narrative, but nonetheless, it's a narrative. So I'm not suspicious of my own negative meta narrative, and there is something paradoxical about that. And then you say specifically about tolerance, and that then is a question not so much about cognition primarily, but about how we are going to relate to each other, given that we have different cognitions, different values, and so forth. And so one thing that does seem to be built into postmodernism is that it has to be initially a rejection of tolerance. Because as you phrased it, tolerance is to say every individual should be left to think for himself, think for herself, act according to their own lights, as long as they are tolerant with respect to other people doing the same sort of thing. And so partly tolerance is seen as inhering in individuals, but it is also a universal claim. And so sometimes postmoderns might start off saying, well, nobody really knows the truth. I'm skeptical. So therefore, I guess we all have to be tolerant of each other, tolerant of diversity, tolerant of difference, and so forth. But then that is to assert a universal moral principle. We should all be tolerant. But my skepticism seems to undercut my capacity to think in terms of and accept such a universal, all-embracing principle. So then I think the second or third part of what you were saying is then to say, well, if cognitively we seem to be built struggling with paradox and internal contradictions, maybe what we should be doing is looking at not what the postmoderns say, but what they do. Because in practice, right, if you can't act a contradiction, right? You have to make a decision which way you are going to go. So I then might say, officially, my philosophy is I'm skeptical about everything, but in fact, I actually make some commitments to some sort of a worldview, and I believe and I act in the world according to that set of commitments. And I argue for them, and I bring in evidence, and I ask other people to listen to my arguments and come to agree with me. So that might be a performative contradiction. That is to say, how I'm performing does not match my my official philosophy, but you then might be right to say it's the performance and the action that is really the more important thing in figuring out what's going on in postmodernism. And you might be right, now that we are 2 generations into it. The first big generation of postmoderns were in the 1960s and in the 1970s. So then you jump forward, a generation, you get to the new millennium, but already that's 25 years ago. So now we're into a third generation of young people, and one hesitates to make predictions here, but it has seemed to me for a long time that there is nothing new at all in postmodernism intellectually, because it's the same arguments being cycled and recycled over the decades. And I think within postmodernism, when I read postmoderns, you don't get the sense from them that they are the exciting new wave coming up with new arguments. They recognize that they are just recycling various kinds of tropes that they've heard over the decades. So maybe it really is not so much an intellectual movement at all anymore, but it just has become an activist movement. Or you have a group of people who are using postmodern ideas, but really they have a set of commitments. They want the world to go in a certain way. Maybe they still have some lingering sense of utopia. They don't think that they can prove that it exists, but it matters to them personally and subjectively. So they're just going to enter into, the ugly social world and use whatever tools and weapons they have to fight for their subjectively held set of values.
Postmodernism then can be a tool for transcending a conflict. Let's take socialism. We see it doesn't work. It can be a tool for transcending this inner conflict of seeing that something that's your ideology doesn't work by just rejecting rational counter arguments. So it's a cultural expression of narcissism, so to speak, where skepticism becomes like a defense mechanism to the uncomfortable truth and moral accountability, right? Because I think that skepticism here is actually more about human fear and self-preservation, and which is it's a rabbit hole to go down to. So yeah, and so they live in a world where this is a tool that allows them to um, reinterpret failure as success. So now I have a question that I would like to ask. Yeah, go
Not
ahead.
necessarily to interpret it as success, but rather to reinterpretate and set aside the failure. Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. Now we do know that most of the postmoderns are deeply political animals, right? And they see everything through a political lens, and so that tends to suggest that for them personally, right, politics and a certain set of political commitments are deepest in their being, in their psychology. And so, as you suggest, right, the official philosophy is a set of tools or weapons, right, that they are using on behalf of their deeply committed politics. So they will say, yeah, you've got all of this evidence against my politics, but now I've got this epistemological tool that allows me to say, well, evidence is just, white male power structures, etc. And so I can set aside that evidence. Or here's a logical argument or a mathematical argument. Well, then I've got this tool in my epistemological toolkit that just says, well, logic and mathematics are just based on arbitrary semantic definitions. And so I can set aside all of those logical and mathematical arguments. And so I think that is exactly how postmodern philosophy is used by many people who first start out as political activists. And I think this then points out to, as you, I think, at least started to say, that there's a more general human condition here, that we know many people, and not just in their politics, but in their religious lives or in their romantic lives, they are so subjectively committed to something that they want it to be true. And what they then do is anytime anybody points out some counter evidence, they immediately come out with these same tools. Well, that's just evidence. That's just your interpretation. You have a bias against it, whatever it is, in order to be able to set aside the uncomfortable criticism of one's religion. Right? We know the many religions are strongly religious people. This is like hopefully only a minority of them now. For them, their faith commitment is so deep that they're just not open to reason. They are not open to evidence, and they've got a standard list of ways of countering anybody who wants to come up with arguments against their position. Or the same thing This is not to meant to be too flip, but think about many young people, actually even older people. You meet someone, and the way human psychology and biology works is if it's your kind of person, right? You make this strong romantic commitment to this. This person is perfect. This person is beautiful. This is my dream person. And in the early days of that relationship, it is impossible psychologically for many people to see anything wrong with the other person. And if anybody comes along and says, there's a little red flag here that maybe you should pay attention to, what that person will do is react very hostilely against the person who is, you know, pointing out the counter evidence and suggesting that maybe there is a red flag there. And it is the same psychological defense mechanisms that are used in the case of religion and in the case of postmodernism. So I think that is territory that's well worth exploring if one's interested in not just seeing postmodernism as a set of philosophical arguments for a position, but as a psychological phenomenon as well.
You guys in the US have a debt that has grown to 1 trillion in the past 3 months, while your economy only grew by 5.5 trillion in the past 3 years. How's that one for you? I can offer you a degree of safety against inflation. You can now be less miserable about the prices, which seem to always rise more than expected, as the inflation just won't go away. Look, the government isn't going to take care of you, so forget the protests and do it yourself. Take matters into your own hands is what successful people do. I decided to help my audience shelter their assets and diversify them into gold, which is something that has always been used by the rich to preserve wealth throughout the history. Birch Gold Group makes the process straightforward. They can help you convert your existing IRA or a 401k account into a tax advantaged physical gold IRA without any of the out pocket costs. Just text Captainese to 989898 and receive their free info kit on gold IRAs that is packed with insider information on how gold and silver can protect your savings. I've checked out their references before partnering with them, and their endorsements include Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, and Ron Paul, and I trust these people. With an A-plus rating with the Better Business Bureau, Gold now has 5-star reviews and thousands of happy customers. Birch Gold Group is the nation's #1 gold IRA provider. To learn more, text Captainese to 989898 and claim your free info kit on gold IRAs. You also have the link in the description below. That's very interesting. So I think, yeah, anything goes as long as you disarm the enemy to your ideology. I think I just remembered now. I'm not sure what I was commenting on, but I wrote a comment, a very opinionated comment about something, and then sometime later, I guess, I saw a comment that I disagreed with, and I commented and offered my opinion. Well, turns out I commented on my own comment that was a previous comment. So when you are arguing, I'm saying that it's you need a tool for destabilizing the other opinion just for the sake of winning. So um, basically, I disagreed with myself in order to win the argument, right? Do you think in that way we are kind of hey, do you think we could be guilty though of criticizing something here that is on a macro level while we are doing it on a micro level? Because we are wired to defend our narratives, and ideology, I think, naturally reinforces itself. I mean, criticizing is criticizing socialists for ego protection fair, or is it just a mirror of the same problem we all have? I mean, they do have a problem with it, but I'm just saying that we may be guilty of it as well. Could postmodernism be merely more explicit of what everyday people implicitly do? So defend a worldview to essentially maintain coherence of meaning.
Yes. Right. What I'd say to that is no, no, we are subject to all kinds of cognitive weaknesses. just as we are all subject to all kinds of physical weaknesses. But I think that is precisely why we need to have a healthy philosophy, a healthy epistemology, so that when we are using our minds, uh, we are attending to the evidence and attending to the logic. And when all of these other cognitive weaknesses arise, and they will arise, right? I will get tired. My emotions will be triggered. I will realize I have to change my thinking on something or other, and I am resistant to that. Or I said this publicly, and now I have to change my mind, and people are going to make fun of me. So there are all of these things that are going to happen to us psychologically. But the point of a good philosophy and a good epistemology is to say, here are the recognizing that if you are going to make progress rather, be aware of those things, and here's how to counter those things successfully. And here's how to use one's mind in order to advance your thinking successfully. For exactly the same reason, we are physically subject to all kinds of weaknesses. We can be lazy, we can want to eat the wrong kinds of food, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we need is to have explicit standards of nutrition, explicit standards of health to attend to, so that when I say I'm going to eat, I'm going to choose this good stuff instead of this bad stuff. It's not to say that I'm never going to be tempted to eat the bad stuff, and that sometimes once in a while I will eat the bad stuff. Or I should work out consistently. At the same time, recognizing that many days I am going to feel lazy and not motivated. The point of the explicit standards is to help you deal with precisely those physical weaknesses when they arise. So, yes, we are all subject to all of those things, but there's a difference between saying we can nonetheless figure out how to use our bodies well to achieve health. We can learn how to use our minds well in order to achieve knowledge despite all of those weaknesses. And we've developed a philosophy of nutrition. We've developed a philosophy of exercise. We've developed a philosophy of cognition and epistemology to help us to do so, versus someone who says, on the weak side of things, I'm going to give into some of my weaknesses as a matter of principle, as a matter of policy. I don't want to do all of that hard work for intellectual fitness or for physical fitness. So I am going to develop a philosophy or use various philosophical tools as principles in order to rationalize the weakness side of me, because I don't want to believe that it's possible for me or for other people actually to become physically healthy and cognitively healthy. So, yes, we're all subject to the weaknesses, but if you elevate the weaknesses to a universal principle and say only weakness exists, then that, I think, is a philosophical problem. And I have less of a problem with ordinary people who do so. Although I do think that by the time we are adults, we should be more physically savvy about our health. We should be more psychologically and philosophically savvy about what's going on in our minds. I think there is such a thing as healthy maturity that all human beings can strive for and achieve. But I am much less sympathetic to the philosophers and the intellectuals who are supposed to be smart people whose profession is to help ordinary people figure out all of the important things. And all of those intellectuals who come down with consistently negative, skeptical, hostile, adversarial, cynical conclusions and push those on everybody, I think those people are morally problematic as well as philosophically
Though,
problematic.
for instance, what we thought was healthy food in the 70s now turns out to not be healthy food. I want to ask you something, and it's going to be a double question. So the first question is going to be, I know we're running out of time. The first question is going to be your personal take on what you think about that. And the second one is going to be how the postmodernists view it. And that's the question of morality. So what does it mean to act right? How can individuals navigate their ethical responsibility in their little framework? And so, for instance, if I acted in a certain way in the 60s, or if I had a slave or two, I could still be seen as a good person. But today, it's a huge no-no. Back then, if I happened to be gay, it was a big deal. Today, not really. How do I know that something that I am doing or not doing today that I see as moral is not just a morality placebo effect of me believing that I'm moral, that and then 700 years later it's going to turns out I was not moral in fact. How can we actually say what morality is? No, I sound like a postmodernist just asking that, but I just really want to know because sometimes I'm thinking about my own behavior actually, whether or not it's actually good because I've been on this earth for only 30 years now, and even in these 30 years, what I did when I was, let's say, 24, and now what I did at 24, I would label that as not moral. So how do I actually know I am on the right track, or is it then like a constant flow of learning and uh, accumulating knowledge and then just figure it out to your best ability, basically winging it, so to speak.
Yeah. Clearly, we're going to have another interview next year, just focusing on the philosophy of ethics and morality and so on. So that's a huge subset issues. But my short answer would be just to say that issues of moral knowledge are no different in principle from any other kind of knowledge. Scientific knowledge, technological knowledge, just ordinary knowledge about the way the world works. And as in any claim of knowledge, you need to identify objectively the facts that are involved and have a standard by which you are going to evaluate. So that's partly an epistemological issue of what are the facts that would be the data that we're integrating when we're trying to come up with making distinctions between good and bad and right and wrong. And partly then it's going to be a matter of can we abstract to a principle standard that says in principle, good things they meet this description, bad things meet this other description over here. And that then is to say it's another like subscience, just to say, well, how do I know that any theory is true versus false? So the distinction between the true and the false, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly, right? Again, we have a big project. Now, this is more difficult, though, because as complicated as human cognition is, right? We're trying to figure out how our senses work, how our memory systems work, how our cognitive abstraction capacities work, our linguistic capacities, our capacities for imagining and reimagining and putting things to the logical and mathematical test and so on. All of that is extraordinarily complicated, but that's just about human cognition, which is a part of human life. If you then say, well, add all of the rest of human life, and we want to have standards not only of good thinking and bad thinking, we want to have good living and bad living, it's going to be an even more complicated project. Now, that's just a promissory note, right, to say that it's a kind of science, but a very complicated science, and because it's very complicated, that's why we've been having the arguments that we've had for millennia over those moral standards. Now, let me just say one more quick thing. If we start to say what are the kind of the facts that go into our making a distinction between good and bad, one of the questions, of course, is, well, where would one go looking for such facts? We know religious philosophy say, well, you have to leave the natural world and go to another dimension and seek the basic facts in the mind of God or in God's pronouncements as well. Some people will say, well, where we do is instead of looking out there, we look inside and we consult our emotions and we see what sort of good and bad doesn't map onto what God said. Good and bad maps onto I feel a certain way positively, or I feel a certain way negatively. So they're making claims that it's subjective facts that are the grounding here. Now, my view is naturalist. I think we look to nature, including human nature, and partly that value questions or good questions are relational questions. We have to identify some facts about what it is to be a human being and what it is out there in reality. So, for example, if I want to say just a commonplace thing, suppose we say we agree that oxygen is good for human beings. So there I've used that normative term. It's good. Being starved for oxygen is a bad thing for human beings. If we accept that that's already like okay uses of good and bad language, then what we're trying to then say, well, when we are making that normative claim, what are we looking at? I would say we are looking at a complex network of facts. We say things like, well, oxygen has a certain molecular structure, and given my biological constitution, another set of facts about my biology, oxygen is necessary for my biological process to carry on. So, oxygen is a resource, and resources are good out there in the environment, but it's good in relation to my biological constitution. And if I have oxygen, then factually it does certain things in my system, and so I carry on living. And if I don't have oxygen, then my biological system breaks down and I die. So what we're then doing is saying oxygen is good in this complex relational factor. It's not like good in itself. It's not good because it stokes my emotions in a certain way. It's good because of certain biological facts about me and certain physical facts about or chemical facts about the nature of oxygen. But then at the same time, what we're doing is we are appealing to a standard. Oxygen is good because it is necessary for me to live. And not having oxygen is bad because I will die. So what we're then proposing is, again, there is a factual difference, a real difference between being alive and being dead. And that serves as the standard. That which is life enhancing is the good. That which leads in the direction of death is the bad. Now, that then is just to say, again, this is a very quick introduction to all of this, that we're looking at facts of the world, chemical facts, biological facts, and we are putting those together in a complex statement and appealing to a standard, the difference between life and death, mapping good and bad ultimately onto that standard, and then more specifically getting down to things like oxygen. And now that already is a big philosophical move, right, that we are making. They're saying oxygen is not good because, well, I need to consult scripture to see what God says about oxygen, right? Or I just consult my emotions and I see what, how I feel about oxygen. Or that I just happen to be raised in a culture that likes oxygen, but maybe I could be raised in a culture that doesn't like oxygen and everything is socially relative. It's not a social fact. It's not an emotional fact. It's not a religious fact. It's a natural biological fact. So I would start there. And already that is a big philosophical move to make, and then start to get into other more complicated issues and build up an ethics theory on the basis of that.
Maybe now just one last question because it really pops out and I think it's important to mention it. Oh, I'm out? I'm out? Oh, yeah, I'm in. Yeah, I'm in. Okay. Um, s- do you think that controlling language, which is happening now, especially in the West, um, essentially is controlling the ability for ethical reasoning? Because I'm sure you would agree that language doesn't just express thought, it structures it. Because words can carry not only meaning, but moral framework. So then when the language is co-opted through propaganda or political politically loaded terminology, right? Then the ethical reasoning can also be altered. So, for example, from personal experience, calling civilian casualties as collateral damage automatically reshapes how people view responsibility and harm. And ethics, I think, require reflection and empathy and judgment. And if the tools for articulating moral distinctions are manipulated, then the range of conceivable ethical positions also narrow in this sense, right? So then controlling the language could be like a soft version of ethical control. But so anyway, my question is, we do agree on that, right? Okay. So my question is, that however, history does show that there are cases where like abandoning a certain term did reduce injustice. So abandoning the word nigger, about how I just said it. Fuck it. Abandoning the word retarded and replacing it with something that's like more with some updated clinical term, right? So, but sometimes that's good. But what criteria lets us distinguish um, a language reform that's good from a coercive one that it's about control? So who decides by what standard? I know I'm sounding like a true postmodernist again, but if society abandons a certain term because it's judged as misleading or degrading, who has the epistemic authority to make that call? And what would count as rational rather than political? I'm just trying to not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Continuing to learn. And part of continuing to learn is changing your language use when it's appropriate. And that leads into one of your follow-up questions. If we are going to be social, one of the important things we do socially is we talk to each other, and in a way that actually communicates what's going on. And so we need to develop all kinds of norms of communication for healthy conversation and so on. Then you point out, yeah, we all kind of recognize that precisely for those various kinds of social ends. They have some sort of power agenda that they want to engage in. And here we use, right, the concepts of propaganda. I need to get the facts and get all of the facts out and show logically how those facts should be put together to show that this person is guilty, or to show that this person has the benefit of the doubt and should be found not guilty, for individuals to try to figure out the way the world works. They don't see language even as a tool of communication for individuals to trade ideas with each other.
So it's a matter of, hey, that's great. So it's a matter of intent rather than using it as a tool or as an object. Because mind you, these two lawyers at a glance, they are functioning completely similar. It's just that the intents of. So you see evil as not ignorance, but as, well, anyway. Okay. Said next year.
But I do know this.